We are now in the month of April 2023. I did not get a chance to talk about the escalating situation in eastern Syria between occupying U.S. forces and militia groups targeting them. I want to go back and take a look at that because I think this is going to be a very important area to keep an eye on as we watch the U.S. proxy war in Ukraine against Russia continue, and as the U.S. prepares some sort of conflict with China in the Pacific region. At the end of March, there was a drone strike at one of these U.S. bases in eastern Syria. The U.S. has been illegally occupying Syria since 2014. This was followed by a U.S. retaliatory strike, and then this was followed up by another strike on U.S. forces, and there were several injuries in that more recent attack, and there was a death, an American contractor and several U.S. soldiers and another contractor injured in the original attack. And this is all from the New York Times in their article, "Conflict in Syria Escalates Following Attack That Killed a U.S. Contractor." This is dated March 24th, 2023. The article says, the initial attack on Thursday came as American forces in northeast Syria were on high alert following 78 attacks by Iran-backed militias since January 2021. But a self-destructing drone, kamikaze drone, which American officials said was of Iranian origin, managed to hit a coalition base anyway, killing the U.S. contractor and wounding 6 other Americans. And then it says the conflict in northeast Syria escalated on Friday as Iran-backed militias launched a volley of rocket and drone attacks against coalition bases after American reprisals for a drone attack that killed a U.S. contractor and injured 6 other Americans. And then since this article, we have this from CNN. This is March 31st. U.S. bolsters forces in Middle East following series of attacks on U.S. troops in Syria. And they have pictured here an A-10 ground attack warplane. CNN says the U.S. has bolstered its military force in the Middle East following a series of attacks on U.S. troops in Syria attributed to Iranian-backed militias. The Pentagon said a squadron of A-10 attack aircraft are deploying to the region ahead of a scheduled deployment. The deployment of the attacked aircraft was expedited by several weeks following the attacks in Syria, according to Pentagon spokesman Lieutenant Colonel Phil Ventura. In addition, the U.S. ordered a carrier strike group to remain in the region to support U.S. forces in Central Command, which covers the Middle East, and a squadron of A-10 attack aircraft to the region. Ventura said, "We are committed to supporting the defeat ISIS mission alongside a global coalition in Syria and prepared to respond to a wide range of contingencies in the Middle East if needed," Ventura said in a statement, because they're not fighting ISIS, they're fighting local militias that want to put an end to the illegal U.S. occupation. Elsewhere, this deployment of these A-10 ground attack warplanes, it's speculated that they are being moved into the Middle East so more modern aircraft can be relocated to aid in upcoming hostilities with China that the U.S. is attempting to provoke. But before I talk about how this deployment of A-10s and this attempt to bolster forces in the region, before I talk about how that really isn't going to help and why U.S. forces are vulnerable in the first place, I want to talk about why these U.S. forces are in eastern Syria in the first place. It's very important to understand why the U.S. has troops in eastern Syria, how all of this came to be, so that we can understand where we are now and where we are going. So this all began with the U.S. engineering armed unrest in Syria, actually across the entire Arab world in 2011. That was the so-called Arab Spring. Of course, we're told that that was a spontaneous region-wide uprising. It was nothing of the sort, and the Western media eventually even admitted that. You have articles like this from the New York Times from 2011 even. U.S. groups helped nurture Arab uprisings. And the article says, a number of the groups and individuals directly involved in the revolts and reforms sweeping the region received training and financing from groups like the International Republican Institute, the National Democratic Institute, and Freedom House, a nonprofit human rights organization based in Washington, according to interviews in recent weeks and American diplomatic cables obtained by WikiLeaks. Something else we now take for granted because of WikiLeaks and the sacrifices of Julian Assange, who's now languishing in prison. The New York Times article also mentions the U.S. National Endowment for Democracy by name. All of these groups they just listed are subsidiaries of the NED. And these political opposition groups served as a smokescreen for armed conflict prepared well in advance, years in advance. And we know that because Seymour Hersh, who more recently exposed the U.S. role behind the destruction of the Nord Stream pipelines in 2007, years before the Arab Spring began. He reported about this in his New Yorker article, The Redirection, 2007. And in that article, prophetic article, he says, to undermine Iran, which is predominantly Shia, the Bush administration has decided, in effect, to reconfigure its priorities in the Middle East. In Lebanon, the administration has cooperated with Saudi Arabia's government, which is Sunni, in clandestine operations that are intended to weaken Hezbollah, the Shia organization that is backed by Iran. The U.S. has also taken part in clandestine operations aimed at Iran and its ally Syria. A byproduct of these activities has been the bolstering of Sunni extremist groups that espouse a militant vision of Islam and are hostile to America and sympathetic to Al-Qaeda. In other words, the U.S. was sponsoring terrorists, Al-Qaeda, and organizations that would soon transform into the self-proclaimed Islamic State, or ISIS. They were doing that in 2007, and you can see how U.S. foreign policy transcends presidencies, this beginning under Bush, continuing under Obama, and onward to even to this very day with the Biden administration. They got this going in 2011. They had the political protests, and they had the armed groups that they had prepared years in advance. They created a proxy war to overthrow various governments in the region, including Libya in 2011. But Syria was able to hang on. And by 2014, the proxy war was not doing very well. So the U.S. intervened directly. They did this under the pretext of fighting ISIS, but in reality, they were there to ensure ISIS could make it all the way to Damascus. But then the following year, 2015, by invitation of Syria's internationally recognized government in Damascus, Russia intervened, and they began actually fighting ISIS. And they did so by bombing ISIS supply lines streaming out of NATO territory, and namely Turkey, who at the time was enthusiastically supporting the U.S. proxy war in Syria. And a lot has changed since then. And unless the U.S. and its allies wanted to start a war directly with Russia, there was nothing they really could do about this. The Syrian Arab Army, backed by Russia and also Iran and its allies, managed to take one major city after the other until most of Syria's population centers were back under government control. As a matter of fact, leading up to where we are today. And people may find this familiar. This is also liveuamap.com. This is their Syria map, which they have had going all throughout the proxy war in Syria. And everything in red is government controlled. Green is controlled by these Al-Qaeda, ISIS forces the U.S. backs. And incidentally, one of the major U.S. bases in Syria is located in this area, which straddles the Syrian border and also Jordan and Iraq. And so the U.S. is able to bring in assets from either Jordan or Iraq or both. And then everything in yellow is occupied by the U.S. military and their Kurdish proxies. This is everything, virtually everything east of the Euphrates River, which runs along this line into Iraq. And as you can see, there are oil fields and also the best agricultural land in Syria. So it's 2023. The U.S. proxy war has failed. Syria, with help from Russia, Iran, and their allies, have secured the majority of the population centers in Syria. Why is the United States still in Syria? And why are they occupying the most valuable agricultural lands and the most productive Syrian oil fields? Well, to this day, the U.S. claims that it's there to fight ISIS, though we never see them actually fighting ISIS. We see them fighting local militias. The real reason that they're still in Syria is to freeze and starve the Syrian population into submission. They are deliberately denying Syria food and energy, and also through sanctions, economic reconstruction aid. And this is actually admitted by several U.S. officials. U.S. President Donald Trump admitted they're there for the oil. But there's also a talk given by Dana Stroll. Here's her profile over at the U.S. Department of Defense. She is the Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for the Middle East. And she did this event with the Center for Strategic and International Studies, CSIS. It's called Syria in the Gray Zone, dated November 2019. The link to this video will be in the video description below, but I'm going to play a clip of what Dana Stroll of the U.S. Department of Defense said about why the U.S. is still in Syria.
The United States still had compelling forms of leverage on the table to shape an outcome that was more conducive and protective of U.S. interests. And we identified four. So the first one was the 1/3 of Syrian territory that was owned via the U.S. military with its local partner, the Syrian Democratic Forces. Now, this was a light footprint on the U.S. military, only about 1,000 troops over the course of the Syria Study Group's report, and then the tens of thousands of forces, both Kurdish and Arab, under the Syrian Democratic Forces. And that 1/3 of Syria is the resource-rich, it's the economic powerhouse of Syria. So where the hydrocarbons are, which obviously is very much in the public debate here in Washington these days, as well as the agricultural powerhouse. But we argued that it wasn't just about this 1/3 of Syrian territory that the U.S. military and our military presence owned, both to fight ISIS and also as leverage for affecting the overall political process for the broader Syrian conflict. There were three other areas of leverage. One is political and diplomatic isolation of the Assad regime. This is, in our assessment, one of Russia's goals in the Middle East, is the propaganda win for Russia of rehabilitating Assad on the international stage, of basically forcing the international community to normalize him and welcome him back in without any behavioral changes. So holding the line on diplomatic isolation, preventing embassies from going back into Damascus. Two is the economic sanctions architecture. So some of this is part of the maximum pressure campaign of the Trump administration on Iran, but there's a whole suite of both executive and congressional sanctions on Syria and Bashar al-Assad, both for human rights abuses in Syria and to the backers of Assad for their activities in support of him in Syria. And three was reconstruction aid. So the United States remains the overall largest single donor of humanitarian aid to Syrians both inside Syria and refugees outside of Syria. And there was some stabilization assistance in the part of Syria that was liberated from ISIS and controlled via the Syrian Democratic Forces in northern eastern Syria. The rest of Syria, though, is rubble. And what the Russians want and what Assad wants is economic reconstruction. And that is something that the United States can basically hold a card on via the international financial institutions and our cooperation with the Europeans. So we argued that absent behavioral changes by the Assad regime, we should hold the line on preventing reconstruction aid and technical expertise from going back into Syria.
So since the U.S. is illegally occupying eastern Syria, they never got any sort of UN mandate to be there. They were not invited by the Syrian government. And because they are admittedly there to specifically freeze and starve the Syrian population and to deny the Syrian government reconstruction aid, anyone attacking these U.S. military bases, the U.S. military presence there in East Syria, are doing so in self-defense as defined under international law. And the U.S. retaliating against these attacks is simply attempting to perpetuate its illegal occupation and the crimes against humanity this occupation is meant to facilitate. Now, the United States retaliated once to the drone attack. There were subsequent attacks. The U.S. has yet to retaliate. And I was just looking at this Pentagon press briefing dated March 30th, 2023 by Pentagon Press Secretary Brigadier General Pat Ryder. He talked about how the subsequent attacks on U.S. bases resulted in possibly traumatic brain injuries. And also, when questioned why the U.S. hasn't retaliated yet, he suggested that there may be a retaliation coming sometime in the future. But in reality, what I think is happening, and the reason they would delay that and do it at a later date, is because they don't want to escalate. And think about why the U.S. doesn't want to escalate. They're engaged in an extremely costly proxy war against Russia in Ukraine. They are running out of weapons and munitions for ground forces there. And their naval and military aviation forces are being preserved ahead of some sort of conflict the U.S. is trying to provoke with China in the Pacific. What is actually left for U.S. forces to bring in case there's an escalation in and around the U.S. presence in eastern Syria? Could they mobilize their forces for a large-scale conflict without having to give up their proxy war in Ukraine or give up on this conflict they're trying to provoke with China in the Pacific? I don't think that they have anything to spare. I also want to add some details about the attacks themselves on these bases and the changing nature of warfare in the Middle East and how the U.S. is coming out on the losing end of the dynamics of modern combat in the Middle East. Going back to the original New York Times article, this one, conflict in Syria escalates following attacks that killed a U.S. contractor. The article goes on and it says, 2 U.S. officials said the main air defense system at the base was not fully operational at the time, raising questions about whether the attackers had detected that vulnerability and exploited it, or just happened to send the drone at that time, according to people who spoke on condition of anonymity to discuss the investigation. Brigadier General Patrick Ryder, the Pentagon spokesman, said that the air defense's radar was working, but he declined to discuss any other details of the system, citing operational security and an investigation by the military's Central Command. The article also reveals that the air defense system used on this base is the Avenger. And the Avenger is essentially the man-portable Stinger missile mounted on a Humvee vehicle. And there are additional electronics and networking that make this slightly more useful and effective than just the man-portable version of the Stinger, but not that much more effective. The Stinger missile and man-portable air defense systems in general have their use on a modern battlefield. We see in Ukraine using a variety of man-portable air defense systems, including the Stinger, and it does provide protection against low-flying fixed-wing aircraft, helicopters, and probably certain types of drones, but many other types of targets, warplanes at high altitude, missiles, and other types of drones that fly lower and faster, much like, say, a cruise missile. These have proven much harder to defend against with these kinds of systems. So while they do provide a degree of protection for these U.S. bases in Syria, they fall far short of providing the sort of protection Russia's or even Syria's and Iran's tiered and integrated air defense systems, where they have short-range systems, medium and long-range systems that are all networked together. Each system has a variety of missiles for different types of targets that can be selected and used to maximize the chance of intercepting an incoming target. The U.S. has nothing remotely close to matching this. And this is what has left their bases in Syria vulnerable, and it is what is left Ukraine vulnerable as their Soviet-era air defense systems run out and are destroyed. The Western systems transferred to Ukraine have have failed both in the quantity provided and quality of these systems. And it's not just these man-portable systems or the Avenger that falls short. We have articles like this from NBC News. Why U.S. Patriot missiles failed to stop drones and cruise missiles attacking Saudi oil sites. And please note that it's saying drones and cruise missiles. That's very important to note because these are the type of systems that are now being used to target U.S. bases in eastern Syria. Now, I have talked about many times how the U.S. and the rest of NATO neglected ground-based air defense systems in favor of pursuing air superiority. And this is establishing control over any particular airspace using your warplanes, a combination of warplanes. The U.S. invested heavily in this. They neglected ground-based air defense systems. Russia invested in ground-based air defense systems. Russia now has formidable anti-access area denial capabilities that the U.S. can neither counter nor create on their own. When you establish air superiority over a battlefield, say 20 years ago, you are going up against opponents who didn't have sophisticated missiles, guided rockets, and drones of all kinds. But today on the battlefield, this technology has proliferated across all nations and even into the hands of smaller semi-independent militia groups. And this is what is being used on U.S. positions there in eastern Syria. When you put all of this together, the U.S.'s inability to protect their forces in eastern Syria from these type of weapons, drones, missiles, rockets, other types of artillery, when you put that together with how stretched out the U.S. military is between waging this extensive proxy war against Russia and Ukraine, this military buildup against China in the Pacific, you've got your land-based weapons being depleted in Eastern Europe, and you're trying to accumulate as many naval and air assets as possible in the Pacific, you have nothing left for the Middle East. And then we have the changing geopolitical tide in the region. We have China making peace between Saudi Arabia and Iran. We have Russia making peace between Syria and Turkey. And we have Russia and China working together to bring all of these conflicts to an end and create cooperation among all of these nations. The odd one out is Israel, but as Alexander Mercouris has pointed out in an excellent video he did on the topic, he pointed out how Israel has good relationships with both Russia and China, and you can see where the vector sum of all of this is going. And if Israel wants to continue surviving and thriving, I think they will follow that tide as well. You have the U.S. isolated politically, they're isolated militarily, and this military isolation has the added component of this technological edge they used to hold over the military forces of the Middle East. That has diminished. So it is an unsustainable predicament for the U.S. The U.S. cultivated a number of conflicts all across the Middle East, and they did this to justify their military footprint in the region. They also used these conflicts in a way to hold their supposed allies hostage. They create tensions between Saudi Arabia and Iran, knowing that then Saudi Arabia would need U.S. military backing, actual protection from U.S. forces based in Saudi Arabia, and also a steady flow of weapons and training. Likewise for Turkey, likewise for Israel, likewise for a number of nations. But if Russia and China come in and they solve these conflicts, they offer these nations held hostage by them an exit, and they take it, that diminishes the justification for the U.S. to maintain a military foothold in the region. It also makes it politically and militarily unfeasible to maintain that footprint. So the U.S. occupation of eastern Syria, predicated on denying the people food and energy and resources for reconstruction, already entirely indefensible, it is now becoming militarily unsustainable as well. Only time will tell if the United States will be able to continue its proxy war in Eastern Europe, or its occupation of Eastern Syria, or this military buildup against China over the island province of Taiwan. But I think one thing is for certain: they cannot maintain all three, and it may just be possible they can't maintain any of them. This is a very important conflict to keep an eye on, this occupation of Eastern Syria and everything that develops around it. It is going to be an indicator to the overall strength of the United States, both militarily and geopolitically. I will keep an eye on this. I want to recommend at least two sources that I have followed for years and years: Ava Barrlet and Vanessa Beeley. They have done excellent work regarding Syria. They followed the conflict from 2011 onward. Vanessa is in Syria right now, and they both have a lot of experience traveling to and reporting from Syria. I will put the details of where you can find their work in the video description below. If you thought this video was useful, please like and share. Think about subscribing to my channel. It helps the channel grow. It's totally free to do. Check the video description also for other places you can find and follow my work, as well as to all of these links that I referenced in the video, as well as for ways you can help support my work. I don't monetize my YouTube channel. I never will. If an ad pops up, feel free to skip it because it's not helping me out at all. And if you do want to support my work, please do so through Buy Me a Coffee and also Patreon. And to everyone who has been helping out, whether it's one-time donations month to month, or even if you're just sharing my work with others, getting the word out there so other people can wake up and see what's happening. I greatly appreciate all of that. If you just share my work with others, that is greatly appreciated as well. So I want to thank you. And as always, thank you for watching.